Have you ever wondered what happens when trained wildlife biologists encounter something that shouldn't exist, according to everything they've learned about the natural world? In the dense forests of southeastern Kentucky, where scientific methodology meets ancient mountain folklore, one researcher's documented encounter challenges our fundamental understanding of what inhabits the deepest wilderness areas of Appalachia. What I'm about to share with you isn't speculation or campfire stories. This is a meticulously documented account from Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with 15 years of field experience, whose official research report was quietly buried by the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources in 1997. By the end of 1997, this investigation, you'll understand why her findings were deemed too disturbing for public release, and why 3 subsequent research teams refused to return to the study area she had designated as Site 7. Dr. Chen arrived in the Daniel Boone National Forest in May 1996 as part of a comprehensive biodiversity survey commissioned by the U.S. Forest Service. Her mission was straightforward: catalog wildlife populations in previously unstudied areas of the Cumberland Mountains, with particular focus on potential endangered species habitats. Chen brought impressive credentials to the project: a PhD in wildlife ecology from UC Davis, published research on predator-prey relationships, and extensive experience in remote wilderness areas across North America. The study zone encompassed approximately 40 square miles of dense mixed forest, characterized by steep ridges, narrow valleys, and minimal human presence. Historical records showed the area had been briefly logged in the 1920s, but had remained largely untouched since then. No established trails existed beyond old logging roads that had been reclaimed by vegetation, making Chen's research particularly valuable for understanding how isolated ecosystems develop without human interference. Chen's initial observations, documented in her field journals from May through July 1996, followed standard wildlife research protocols. She established monitoring stations throughout the study area, deployed camera traps at strategic locations, and conducted systematic surveys using established scientific methodologies. Her early findings indicated healthy populations of typical Appalachian fauna: white-tailed deer, black bears, various small mammals, and diverse bird species. However, certain anomalies began appearing in her data by late June. Camera traps positioned along game trails were consistently malfunctioning in specific areas, despite being recently serviced equipment. Motion sensors would trigger, but resulting photographs showed only empty forest or unclear shadowy forms that could have been equipment malfunction or unusual lighting conditions. More puzzling were the acoustic recordings from her automated monitoring stations, which occasionally captured vocalizations that didn't match known species in the region. Chen's first direct encounter occurred on July 23, 1996, while conducting a dawn survey along a ridge approximately 12 miles from her base camp. According to her detailed field notes, she was observing a small clearing through binoculars when movement caught her attention approximately 200 yards distant. What she initially assumed to be a black bear moving through dense undergrowth revealed itself to be something fundamentally different when it briefly entered a patch of direct sunlight. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, Chen wrote in her official report. Height approximately 7 to 8 feet. Body structure suggested significant muscle mass, covered in dark hair or fur. Most disturbing was its apparent awareness of my presence. It turned directly toward my position, despite my concealed location and downwind approach. The facial features were clearly visible through binoculars for approximately 30 seconds before it retreated into heavy forest cover. Chen's scientific training demanded skeptical analysis of her observation. She spent the following week attempting to rationalize what she had seen through conventional explanations. The possibility of misidentification seemed unlikely given her extensive experience with regional wildlife and optimal viewing conditions. The creature's bipedal locomotion and facial structure didn't correspond to any known species, while its apparent intelligence and awareness suggested cognitive capabilities beyond typical forest animals. More encounters followed with increasing frequency. On August 2nd, Chen discovered what appeared to be sleeping areas in dense thickets, circular depressions approximately 8 feet in diameter, lined with carefully arranged vegetation that showed signs of repeated use. The construction technique was unlike anything created by known animals, involving deliberate weaving of branches and leaves in patterns that suggested manual dexterity and planning capability. Her camera traps began capturing more substantial evidence by mid-August. A series of photographs taken over 3 consecutive nights showed large bipedal figures moving through the forest with coordinated behavior that implied group cooperation. The images were grainy due to low light conditions and dense vegetation, but clearly depicted humanoid forms of exceptional size, moving with apparent purpose and awareness of their environment. Most unsettling was Chen's discovery of what she termed observation posts, elevated positions where vegetation had been systematically modified to create concealed vantage points overlooking her research stations. The sophistication of these constructions suggested not only intelligence, but long-term planning and territorial behavior. Someone or something was monitoring her activities with the same systematic approach she was using to study the forest. Chen's research took a dramatic turn on August 15th when she encountered multiple individuals simultaneously. While reviewing data at a remote monitoring station, she became aware of being watched. Looking up from her equipment, she observed at least 4 large bipedal figures positioned at the forest edge, approximately 100 yards away. They stood motionless for several minutes, apparently studying her activities, before withdrawing into the forest in coordinated fashion. Their behavior indicated clear intelligence and social organization, Chen documented. Movement patterns suggested communication and coordination beyond anything observed in known primate species. Most significant was their apparent curiosity about my research methods, rather than simple territorial aggression. They seemed to be studying me as I was studying them. The psychological impact of these encounters began affecting Chen's research methodology. Her field notes from late August show increasing concern about being continuously observed. Equipment was being moved or examined during her absence, with clear evidence of manipulation but no damage. Tool marks on metal components suggested significant strength, while the careful replacement of items indicated intelligence and possibly curiosity about human technology. Chen attempted to establish indirect communication by leaving simple objects at predetermined locations. colored markers, basic tools, and food items were consistently examined and sometimes rearranged in patterns that suggested deliberate response rather than random animal behavior. Most intriguingly, some items were returned with modifications, sticks carved with geometric patterns, stones arranged in specific configurations, vegetation woven into complex structures. The situation escalated in early September when Chen discovered evidence of what appeared to be family groups. Hidden cameras captured images of adults accompanied by smaller individuals, suggesting reproductive populations rather than isolated individuals. The implications were staggering. If these creatures represented an unknown species, their apparent intelligence, social organization, and reproductive success indicated a stable population that had somehow remained hidden from scientific documentation. Chen's final documented encounter occurred on September 18, 1996. While conducting a routine equipment check, she found herself surrounded by approximately 8 individuals who had approached with remarkable stealth. Rather than flee or demonstrate aggression, they maintained positions at the forest edge, while one individual approached to within 50 feet of her location. The encounter lasted approximately 20 minutes, Chen wrote in her final report. The primary individual displayed behavior suggesting high intelligence, examining my equipment from a distance, mimicking some of my actions, and maintaining what could only be described as eye contact. Facial features were clearly humanoid, but with significant differences from Homo sapiens. When I slowly retrieved my camera, the group withdrew immediately, but without panic, suggesting understanding of the equipment's purpose. This final encounter convinced Chen that she was dealing with something beyond her field of expertise. Her biological training couldn't account for a species that combined human-level intelligence with physical characteristics unknown to science. The implications were too significant for a single researcher to handle through standard academic channels. Chen submitted her preliminary findings to the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources in October 1996, including detailed field notes, photographs, and recommendations for expanded research involving anthropologists, linguists, and other specialists. The response was immediate and decisive. Her contract was terminated, all research materials were confiscated, and the study area was closed to further scientific investigation. Official explanations cited budget constraints and shifting research priorities, but Chen's attempts to discuss her findings with colleagues were met with administrative pressure to cease all communication about the project. Her photographs and video footage were declared classified under environmental protection statutes, effectively removing them from scientific review. Chen attempted to continue her research independently, but found access to the study area blocked by newly erected barriers and regular security patrols. Local residents, who had previously been cooperative, suddenly became reluctant to discuss anything related to unusual wildlife observations. The systematic suppression of her research suggested institutional awareness of what she had discovered. In her final communication to colleagues before leaving Kentucky, Chen wrote, "The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond wildlife biology. We may be dealing with evidence of human evolutionary development that challenges fundamental anthropological assumptions. The intelligence and social organization I observed cannot be explained by current scientific paradigms. More disturbing is the institutional response, which suggests prior knowledge of these phenomena and deliberate suppression of research. Chen left Kentucky in December 1996 and accepted a position with the Canadian Wildlife Service, where she resumed conventional research on documented species. However, her Kentucky experience had lasting effects on her scientific perspective. Colleagues noted changes in her approach to fieldwork, with increased attention to unexplained observations and greater skepticism toward institutional research limitations. The study area designated as Site 7 remains closed to scientific research, officially classified as a sensitive ecological zone requiring protection from human disturbance. However, satellite imagery from recent years shows continuing modification of the forest canopy in patterns that suggest ongoing intelligence-directed activity. Trails appear and disappear, clearing sizes change, and vegetation patterns shift in ways that cannot be explained by natural processes alone. Local folklore has long included stories of wild people, or wood boogers, living in the deepest mountain areas. But Chen's documentation provided the first systematic scientific evidence supporting these accounts. Her research suggested that Appalachian wilderness may harbor surviving populations of unknown hominid species that have developed sophisticated survival strategies, including deliberate avoidance of human contact. The broader implications of Chen's findings remain largely unexplored due to institutional suppression and the classified status of her documentation. However, her research represents a crucial data point in understanding the limits of current scientific knowledge about North American biodiversity. The systematic nature of her observations, combined with her impeccable professional credentials, makes her account particularly significant for researchers investigating anomalous wildlife reports. Recent developments have added new dimensions to Chen's original research. GPS tracking data from wildlife management agencies occasionally shows movement patterns in the Site 7 area that don't correspond to known animal behavior. Automated trail cameras positioned for standard wildlife monitoring have captured images similar to those documented by Chen, though these are typically classified as equipment malfunctions or photographic artifacts. Most intriguingly, acoustic monitoring equipment designed to track bird populations has recorded vocalizations in the Site 7 area that demonstrate characteristics suggesting linguistic communication. Sound analysis reveals complex patterns of repetition, variation, and apparent response that indicate intelligence-directed communication rather than simple animal vocalizations. Dr. Chen's Kentucky research stands as testament to the limitations of current scientific understanding of Appalachian wilderness. Her systematic documentation of an unknown species challenges fundamental assumptions about North American biodiversity while highlighting institutional resistance to paradigm-shifting discoveries. The continued classification of her findings suggests that some aspects of our natural world remain too extraordinary for public acknowledgement. The mountains keep their secrets well, but occasionally, trained observers like Dr. Chen provide glimpses into mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about the creatures that share our world. Her courage in documenting and reporting these encounters, despite professional consequences, offers invaluable insight into the unknown inhabitants of America's last wild places. Whether her discoveries represent surviving populations of prehistoric hominids, evolutionary adaptations to extreme isolation, or something else entirely, remains unanswered. What her research definitively establishes is that the deepest forests of Appalachia harbor intelligences that have successfully avoided scientific documentation for centuries, watching us as we believe we are studying them. The beast people of the mountains remain in their ancient territory, as elusive and intelligent as ever, leaving only traces for those few researchers brave enough to venture beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific understanding. In the autumn of 1973, Dr. Marcus Fieldstone arrived in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky to conduct ethnographic research on isolated Appalachian communities. What he discovered in the settlement of Hollow Ridge would fundamentally challenge his understanding of human social development and force him to confront possibilities that academic science had long dismissed as folklore. Dr. Fieldstone, an anthropologist from the University of Chicago, had secured a grant to document the linguistic and cultural practices of mountain communities that had remained largely untouched by modern civilization. His initial research focused on dialect preservation and traditional crafts, work that he believed would contribute to scholarly understanding of cultural isolation in America's rural highlands. Hollow Ridge appeared on no official maps. Located in a narrow valley accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through dense forest, the community consisted of approximately 40 families living in conditions that seemed frozen in the previous century. The residents operated without electricity, running water, or telephone service, maintaining what appeared to be a deliberately chosen separation from the outside world. What immediately struck Dr. Fieldstone as unusual was the community's physical uniformity. Every resident possessed remarkably similar features: unusually tall and lean builds, pale skin that seemed almost translucent, and eyes of such a light blue they appeared nearly colorless. More disturbing was their synchronized behavior patterns. Conversations would stop abruptly when he approached, only to resume in perfect unison when he moved away. The community's leader, a man known only as Elder Thomas, served as Dr. Fieldstone's primary contact during his initial weeks of research. Elder Thomas claimed the settlement had been established in 1823 by a group of families seeking religious freedom, though he could provide no documentation to support this claim. When pressed for historical records, genealogical information, or even basic administrative documents, Elder Thomas would simply state that such matters were handled according to the old ways. Dr. Fieldstone's first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came during his third week of residence. While documenting traditional food preservation techniques, he observed the community's preparation for what they called the monthly gathering. This event, held during each new moon, involved the entire population assembling in a circular clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees that formed an almost perfect natural amphitheater. The anthropologist positioned himself at a concealed observation point approximately 50 yards from the gathering site. What he witnessed challenged every assumption he had made about the community's nature and origins. The residents arranged themselves in concentric circles around a central fire, but their movements displayed a precision that suggested extensive rehearsal or instinctive coordination. Elder Thomas began the ceremony by speaking in what initially sounded like an archaic dialect of English. However, as Dr. Fieldstone listened more carefully, he realized the vocalizations contained phonetic elements that didn't correspond to any known human language. The sounds seemed to emerge from deeper in the throat than normal speech, creating resonances that carried unnaturally far through the mountain air. As the ceremony progressed, something even more disturbing became apparent. The participants began a synchronized chanting that gradually shifted from recognizable words to purely tonal expressions. But most unsettling was the physical transformation that seemed to occur as the ritual intensified. In the flickering firelight, the residents' features appeared to elongate and sharpen, their pale skin taking on an almost luminescent quality. Dr. Fieldstone later documented that several participants displayed physical characteristics that seemed anatomically impossible. Their limbs appeared to extend beyond normal human proportions, and their movements suggested joint flexibility that exceeded typical skeletal limitations. Most disturbing were their eyes, which reflected the firelight with an intensity reminiscent of nocturnal predators. The anthropologist's scientific training compelled him to consider rational explanations. Perhaps the firelight created optical illusions, or his own fatigue and isolation had affected his perception. But his detailed field notes, recorded immediately after each observation, consistently described the same impossible phenomena. During his fourth week in Hollow Ridge, Dr. Fieldstone made a discovery that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the community's true nature. While exploring the forest surrounding the settlement, he encountered a series of caves that the residents had warned him to avoid. His academic curiosity overcame their warnings, and he ventured into the largest cavern with portable lighting equipment. The cave system extended far deeper into the mountain than seemed geologically possible. As he explored, Dr. Fieldstone discovered evidence of long-term habitation that predated any known human settlement in the region. The walls contained primitive artwork depicting figures that resembled humans, but possessed the same elongated features he had observed during the monthly gatherings. More disturbing were the carved symbols that covered deeper sections of the caves. These markings showed a sophistication that suggested advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge, yet they appeared to have been created with primitive tools. Carbon dating would later reveal the symbols to be over 800 years old, predating European colonization by centuries. In the deepest accessible chamber, Dr. Fieldstone made his most significant and terrifying discovery. The cavern contained what appeared to be a primitive laboratory where biological experimentation had been conducted over extended periods. Stone tables bore stains that suggested prolonged use for anatomical work, and carved channels in the rock indicated systematic collection and disposal of organic materials. Most disturbing were the bone fragments scattered throughout the chamber. While many appeared to be from known animal species, others displayed characteristics that didn't correspond to any creature in the fossil record. Some fragments showed evidence of deliberate modification, as if the original skeletal structure had been systematically altered through unknown processes. Dr. Fieldstone's documentation of these discoveries led to his first direct confrontation with the community's true nature. Upon returning from the caves, he found Elder Thomas waiting at his temporary quarters with several other residents. Their demeanor had shifted from cautious hospitality to obvious menace. Elder Thomas spoke in the same guttural language Dr. Fieldstone had heard during the monthly gathering, and the other residents responded with synchronized vocalizations that created a sound unlike anything in his experience. The anthropologist later described it as resembling both human speech and animal communication, suggesting intelligence that operated according to entirely different principles than human cognition. What followed was a conversation that challenged Dr. Fieldstone's understanding of human evolution and the nature of intelligence itself. Elder Thomas, speaking now in perfect English, explained that the Hollow Ridge community represented something far older than human civilization. They were, he claimed, descendants of beings that had inhabited these mountains since before the emergence of modern humans. According to Elder Thomas, these beings had observed human development for millennia, occasionally interacting with isolated communities and sometimes integrating with human populations. The residents of Hollow Ridge were the result of centuries of careful genetic selection and modification, creating entities that could function in both human and non-human social structures. The revelation that most disturbed Dr. Fieldstone was Elder Thomas's claim that similar communities existed throughout the Appalachian region, all connected through an underground network that facilitated communication and coordination across vast distances. These settlements served as observation posts, allowing the beings to monitor human development while remaining hidden from mainstream society. Dr. Fieldstone's academic training insisted that such claims were impossible, yet the physical evidence he had gathered suggested explanations that conventional science couldn't accommodate. The biological samples he had collected displayed genetic markers that didn't correspond to known human populations, and the cave artwork depicted knowledge that shouldn't have existed in pre-Columbian America. During his final week in Hollow Ridge, Dr. Fieldstone observed a demonstration that convinced him of the community's non-human origins. Elder Thomas led him to a remote section of the valley where several residents were engaged in what appeared to be communication with the local wildlife. Birds, deer, and even predators approached the humans without fear, responding to the same guttural vocalizations used during the monthly gatherings. More impressive was the residents' apparent ability to influence animal behavior through these communications. Dr. Fieldstone watched as complex instructions were conveyed to various species, resulting in coordinated activities that suggested genuine interspecies cooperation rather than simple domestication. The anthropologist's research concluded abruptly when Elder Thomas informed him that his presence had been tolerated for educational purposes, but that continued observation would not be permitted. The community, he explained, had allowed Dr. Fieldstone to document their existence as part of a larger evaluation of whether humanity was ready for broader contact with their species. Dr. Fieldstone left Hollow Ridge with extensive documentation, but was forbidden from returning or revealing the community's location. His attempts to relocate the settlement using GPS coordinates proved futile, as the valley appeared to have been completely abandoned. Satellite imagery showed only undisturbed forest where the community had stood. The anthropologist's subsequent academic papers, which carefully avoided specific claims about non-human intelligence, were met with skepticism from the scientific community. His documented observations were dismissed as misinterpretation of cultural practices or deliberate fabrication designed to gain professional attention. However, Dr. Fieldstone's research attracted the attention of government agencies that had been investigating reports of anomalous communities throughout Appalachia. His documentation provided scientific credibility to accounts that had previously been dismissed as folklore or hallucination. Classification of Dr. Fieldstone's complete research files under national security provisions prevented public access to his most detailed findings. The official position maintained that his work documented an isolated human community with unusual cultural practices and physical characteristics, resulting from generations of geographic isolation. Yet elements of Dr. Fieldstone's account continue to surface in reports from hikers, researchers, and government personnel working in remote Appalachian regions. Descriptions of communities that seem to appear and disappear, residents with impossible physical characteristics, and evidence of intelligence that operates according to non-human principles suggest that Hollow Ridge was not an isolated phenomenon. The implications of Dr. Fieldstone's research extend far beyond anthropological curiosity. If his observations were accurate, they suggest the existence of intelligences that have coexisted with humanity while remaining largely undetected. These beings possess knowledge of human behavior accumulated over centuries, along with capabilities that current science cannot explain or duplicate. Most disturbing is the possibility that such communities serve as monitoring stations for a larger intelligence that has been observing human development since before recorded history. Dr. Fieldstone's encounter with Hollow Ridge may represent humanity's first documented contact with beings that have been studying us far longer than we have been aware of their existence. The mountains of Appalachia continue to harbor secrets that challenge our understanding of human history and the nature of intelligence on Earth. Dr. Fieldstone's research suggests that we may not be alone on this planet, and that we may never have been. Have you ever wondered what happens when an entire academic career gets destroyed by a single field research expedition? In November 1962, Dr. Catherine Walsh, a respected anthropologist from Columbia University, ventured into the remote hills of eastern Tennessee to document what she believed would be isolated folk customs. What she encountered instead would shatter her understanding of human evolution and force the academic community to question whether we truly know what species share these ancient mountains with us. Dr. Walsh's research began innocuously enough. She had secured a grant to study the linguistic patterns and cultural practices of mountain communities that had remained largely untouched by modern civilization. Her focus was specifically on the settlement of Birch Hollow, a community of approximately 60 families nestled in a valley so remote that it appeared on no official maps and could only be reached by following a series of unmarked logging roads that wound deep into the Cumberland Mountains. The journey to Birch Hollow itself should have served as a warning. Dr. Walsh's hired guide, a local man named Tom Brennan, grew increasingly nervous as they approached the valley. He repeatedly asked if she was certain about her destination, explaining that his own grandfather had warned him never to venture beyond certain landmarks in those particular hills. When pressed for specifics, Brennan could only say that the people who lived in Birch Hollow were different in ways that outsiders wouldn't understand until it was too late to turn back. Dr. Walsh arrived in Birch Hollow on November 12, 1962, expecting to find a typical Appalachian settlement struggling with the economic and social challenges common to isolated mountain communities. Instead, she discovered a thriving society that operated according to principles she couldn't immediately comprehend. The residents exhibited a level of physical coordination and environmental awareness that seemed to exceed normal human capabilities. They moved through their forest territory with an almost predatory grace, navigating dense undergrowth and treacherous terrain with ease that suggested generations of evolutionary adaptation to their specific environment. Most striking was their apparent ability to communicate without spoken language. Dr. Walsh observed family groups coordinating complex activities through subtle variations in posture, facial expressions, and what appeared to be subsonic vocalizations that registered more as vibrations felt through the ground than actual sounds. When they did speak, their English carried dialectical elements that Dr. Walsh couldn't trace to any known regional linguistic patterns. Certain words seemed to emerge from deeper in their throats than normal human speech anatomy would typically allow. The community's leader, a man known simply as Old Man Garrett, served as Dr. Walsh's primary contact during her initial weeks of residence. Garrett claimed the settlement had been established by his great-grandfather in the 1820s, though he could provide no documentation to support this timeline. When questioned about family genealogies or historical records, Garrett would simply state that such information was preserved according to methods that outsiders wouldn't recognize or understand. Dr. Walsh's first indication that Birch Hollow represented something far more complex than an isolated human community came during her third week of residence. While documenting what she believed were traditional hunting practices, she observed a group of young men tracking deer through dense forest with a precision that defied explanation. They followed scent trails that were completely invisible to Dr. Walsh, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested either extensive training or instinctive behaviors she had never encountered in human populations. More disturbing was their apparent interaction with the local wildlife. Animals that should have fled from human presence instead seemed to respond to subtle signals from the hunters. Dr. Walsh watched in amazement as deer actually moved toward the hunting party rather than away, approaching with a docility that suggested some form of communication or influence she couldn't understand. The hunters then selected their prey through criteria that had nothing to do with size, health, or convenience, instead seeming to follow some internal logic that prioritized animals displaying specific behavioral characteristics. The anthropologist's scientific training compelled her to seek rational explanations for these observations. Perhaps the community had developed unusually sophisticated hunting techniques through generations of necessity and isolation. Perhaps their apparent abilities were simply the result of cultural practices and environmental knowledge that urban academics couldn't appreciate or replicate. Yet as her documentation continued, Dr. Walsh encountered phenomena that challenged her ability to maintain scientific objectivity. During her fourth week in Birch Hollow, Dr. Walsh gained permission to observe what the community called their monthly assembly. This gathering, held during each new moon, involved the entire population congregating in a natural amphitheater formed by an outcropping of limestone cliffs approximately 2 miles from the main settlement. The site itself possessed unusual acoustic properties that seemed to amplify certain frequencies while completely absorbing others, creating an environment where whispered conversations could be heard clearly across considerable distances, while normal speech seemed muffled and indistinct. The ceremony began with what appeared to be a form of collective meditation, with all participants arranged in concentric circles around a central fire pit. As the ritual progressed, Dr. Walsh observed changes in the participants that seemed to extend beyond simple religious or cultural expression. Their breathing synchronized into patterns that created subtle harmonics when combined with the site's natural acoustics. More unsettling, their physical movements began to display a uniformity that suggested either extraordinary coordination or some form of shared consciousness. What followed challenged Dr. Walsh's understanding of human social behavior and biological capability. The assembled community began producing vocalizations that didn't correspond to any known human language or communication system. The sounds seemed to emerge from multiple vocal sources simultaneously, creating complex harmonic patterns that resonated through the limestone formations and generated responses from the surrounding forest. Animals throughout the valley began answering these calls, not with distress or alarm, but with what appeared to be organized responses that suggested genuine interspecies communication. Dr. Walsh later documented that during the height of the ceremony, several participants displayed physical characteristics that seemed anatomically impossible. Their limbs appeared to elongate beyond normal human proportions, and their facial features shifted in ways that suggested bone structure far more flexible than conventional medical understanding would accommodate. In the flickering firelight, their eyes reflected illumination with an intensity reminiscent of nocturnal predators rather than normal human physiology. The anthropologist's attempts to photograph these phenomena proved strangely unsuccessful. Her camera equipment, which had functioned perfectly throughout her journey to Birch Hollow, consistently malfunctioned during the ceremonies. Film emerged from development completely black despite proper exposure settings, and electronic equipment suffered mysterious power failures that couldn't be explained by environmental conditions or user error. When Dr. Walsh questioned community members about these gatherings, she received responses that suggested the rituals served purposes far beyond cultural tradition or religious observance. According to Old Man Garrett, the monthly assemblies maintained what he called the old connections between his people and forces that had shaped the mountains since before human civilization reached North America. The community, he explained, served as guardians of knowledge and responsibilities that predated European colonization by thousands of years. Most disturbing was Garrett's claim that the residents of Birch Hollow weren't entirely human in the conventional sense. They were, according to his account, the result of centuries of careful integration between human settlers and beings that had inhabited these mountains since before recorded history. This explained their unusual physical capabilities, their apparent ability to communicate with local wildlife, and their knowledge of environmental patterns that seemed to exceed what normal human observation could provide. Dr. Walsh's academic training insisted that such claims were impossible, yet the physical evidence she observed suggested explanations that conventional anthropology couldn't accommodate. The community's apparent abilities weren't simply enhanced human capabilities, but represented traits that seemed to derive from entirely different evolutionary pressures. Their interaction with their environment displayed characteristics more commonly associated with predatory animals than human social groups. During her 6th week in Birch Hollow, Dr. Walsh experienced what she later described as the most significant and terrifying revelation of her career. While exploring the forest surrounding the settlement, she discovered a series of caves that the community had warned her to avoid. Her academic curiosity overcame their warnings, and she ventured into the largest cavern system with portable lighting equipment. The caves extended far deeper into the mountain than seemed geologically possible, eventually opening into vast chambers that showed clear evidence of long-term habitation. The walls contained artwork and symbols that depicted the history Garrett had described, showing the gradual integration of human and non-human populations over centuries of careful interbreeding and cultural exchange. More shocking were the biological specimens she found preserved in deeper sections of the caves. Skeletal remains displayed characteristics that seemed to represent transitional forms between human anatomy and something else entirely. The bone structure suggested creatures capable of both bipedal locomotion and quadrupedal movement, with joint flexibility and limb proportions that exceeded the range of known human variation. Carbon dating would later reveal these remains to span over 800 years, suggesting that the process Garrett had described was not recent cultural mythology, but documented biological and social evolution that had been occurring since before European contact with North America. Dr. Walsh's discovery of these caves led to her final and most disturbing encounter with the true nature of Birch Hollow's residents. Upon returning from her unauthorized exploration, she found the entire community waiting for her at the settlement's central gathering area. Their demeanor had shifted from cautious hospitality to obvious concern, and Garrett explained that her intrusion into the sacred caves had violated agreements that governed contact between his people and the outside world. What followed was a demonstration that convinced Dr. Walsh that the residents of Birch Hollow represented a form of intelligence and capability that mainstream science was unprepared to acknowledge. The community members underwent the same physical transformations she had observed during their monthly ceremony, but now in full daylight and at close range, where optical illusions or atmospheric effects couldn't explain what she witnessed. Their bodies seemed to shift between human and animal characteristics with fluid ease, displaying strength, speed, and sensory acuity that exceeded normal human limitations by orders of magnitude. More significantly, they demonstrated what appeared to be genuine telepathic communication, coordinating complex group behaviors without any visible or audible signals. Garrett explained that Dr. Walsh's presence had been tolerated as part of their ongoing evaluation of whether humanity was ready for broader contact with their species. Her unauthorized exploration of the caves had accelerated this timeline and forced them to reveal capabilities they had hoped to keep hidden for several more generations. The anthropologist was informed that she could continue her research for one additional week, after which she would need to leave Birch Hollow permanently. More significantly, she was warned that any attempt to reveal the community's location or publish detailed accounts of their capabilities would result in consequences that extended far beyond academic censure. Dr. Walsh departed Birch Hollow on December 18th, 1962, carrying extensive documentation, but understanding that her career would be forever changed by what she had witnessed. Her subsequent attempts to locate the settlement using the same route she had followed weeks earlier proved futile. The logging roads seemed to lead to entirely different destinations, and local guides claimed no knowledge of any community in the areas she described. The anthropologist's initial research papers, carefully edited to avoid specific claims about non-human intelligence, were met with skepticism from the academic community. Her documentation of unusual cultural practices and environmental adaptation was dismissed as misinterpretation of conventional mountain customs combined with romantic speculation about primitive societies. However, Dr. Walsh's complete field notes, discovered among her effects after her death in 1987, revealed the full scope of her experiences in Birch Hollow. These documents provided detailed descriptions of anatomical observations, behavioral analyses, and photographic evidence that suggested the existence of intelligences that had successfully avoided detection by mainstream society for centuries. Classification of Dr. Walsh's complete research under government security provisions prevented public access to her most significant findings. Official positions maintained that her work documented an isolated human community with unusual cultural practices and environmental knowledge, nothing more. Yet elements of Dr. Walsh's account continue to surface in reports from researchers, hikers, and government personnel working in remote Appalachian regions. Descriptions of communities that appear and disappear without explanation, residents with impossible physical capabilities, and evidence of intelligence that operates according to principles unknown to conventional science suggest that Birch Hollow was not an isolated phenomenon. The implications extend far beyond anthropological curiosity. If Dr. Walsh's observations were accurate, they suggest the existence of intelligences that have coexisted with humanity while remaining largely undetected, possessing knowledge of human behavior accumulated over centuries and capabilities that current science cannot explain or replicate. The mountains of Appalachia continue to harbor secrets that challenge our understanding of human evolution and the nature of intelligence on Earth. Dr. Walsh's research suggests that we may share this planet with beings far more sophisticated and ancient than we have ever imagined, beings that have been observing and evaluating us far longer than we have been aware of their existence. I lay awake most nights, wondering if anyone would believe what I witnessed in October of 1987, deep in the forgotten valleys of eastern Kentucky. 3 decades have passed, yet the memory remains as vivid as the moment it happened. My name is Dr. Margaret Thorne, and I was conducting ethnographic research on isolated Appalachian communities for my doctoral dissertation at the University of Kentucky. What I discovered in the remote settlement of Birch Hollow would forever change my understanding of what exists in the spaces between documented reality and local folklore. My research had led me to investigate communities that maintained traditional ways of life, particularly those practicing what anthropologists term cultural persistence in the face of modernization. Birch Hollow appeared on no official maps, yet persistent references in county records and oral histories suggested a community that had remained virtually unchanged since the late 1800s. The journey required a 2-day hike through unmarked forest trails, following directions passed down through generations of local hunters who spoke of the settlement only in whispers. The first indication that something was amiss came from my guide, a weathered mountain man named Ezra Caldwell, who had agreed to lead me part way into the wilderness. On the morning of our departure, Ezra appeared unusually agitated, constantly checking the tree line and muttering prayers under his breath. When I questioned his behavior, he fixed me with eyes that seemed to have witnessed things he preferred to forget. "Doc," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "some places ain't meant for outsiders. Birch Hollow's one of them places. The families there, they ain't like regular folk. They got ways of knowing when strangers come calling, and they got ways of dealing with them too." Despite his warnings, my academic curiosity overrode any apprehension. I had spent years studying isolated communities, documenting their customs and social structures. Nothing in my experience suggested anything more dangerous than natural suspicion of outsiders common to remote settlements. Ezra left me at a granite outcropping he called Devil's Tooth, pointing toward a barely visible trail that wound deeper into the mountains. "Follow that path for maybe 8 miles, he instructed, already backing away. "When you come to the creek with the red stones, you'll know you're close. But Doc, if you see anything that don't seem right, anything at all, you turn around and come back this way, fast as you can." The trail proved more challenging than anticipated, winding through dense forest where ancient oaks and pines blocked most sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight, even at midday. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of settling wood or the distant call of birds I couldn't identify. After several hours of hiking, I reached the creek Ezra had mentioned, its bed indeed lined with unusual red stones that seemed to pulse with their own inner light in the filtered sunlight. Following the creek upstream, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest around me. The trees grew differently here, their trunks bearing strange scars that formed almost deliberate patterns. Animal tracks in the muddy banks appeared normal at first glance, but closer examination revealed peculiarities that unsettled me. What looked like deer prints showed signs of bipedal movement, with rear hooves occasionally replaced by what resembled human footprints. The settlement of Birch Hollow materialized gradually from the forest, beginning with weathered split-rail fences and cleared fields where corn grew in perfect rows despite the late season. The cabins, constructed from hand-hewn logs darkened by age and weather, clustered around a central area dominated by a large stone building that appeared to serve as both meeting house and trading post. Smoke rose from several chimneys, carrying the scent of burning oak mixed with something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. What struck me immediately was the absence of people. Despite clear signs of habitation and the evidence of recent activity, no one was visible in the fields or moving between buildings. Curtains twitched at windows as I approached, suggesting observers, but no one emerged to greet or challenge a stranger walking boldly into their community. I made my way to the stone building, hoping to find someone willing to discuss the community's history and customs. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the mountain breeze. Inside, the single large room was arranged like a combination general store and meeting hall, with shelves lined with preserved foods, handmade tools, and other necessities of rural life. At the far end, rough-hewn benches faced a raised platform where a lectern suggested regular gatherings. The most unsettling feature was the collection of photographs covering one entire wall. Hundreds of images, ranging from formal family portraits to candid shots of daily life, created a visual history of the community spanning what appeared to be several decades. As I examined these photographs more closely, a disturbing pattern emerged. The faces, while showing variation in age and gender, shared certain unmistakable features. The eyes, in particular, held an unsettling intensity, pupils that seemed too large, and irises of an unusual amber color that caught light in ways that suggested they might glow in darkness. More troubling was the progression visible in the photographs when arranged chronologically. The earliest images showed people with relatively normal human features, but as the years advanced, subtle changes became apparent. Facial structure gradually shifted, with elongated features becoming more pronounced. Hands in later photographs showed fingers that seemed too long, with what appeared to be additional joints. By the most recent images, the subjects bore only passing resemblance to normal human beings. A soft footstep behind me announced that I was no longer alone. I turned to find a woman watching me from the doorway, her appearance immediately confirming the progression I had observed in the photographs. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with limbs that seemed disproportionately long for even her impressive height. Her face, while maintaining human characteristics, had elongated into something almost lupin, with cheekbones that protruded sharply and a jaw that extended further than natural anatomy would suggest. "You are the researcher from the university," she said, her voice carrying an unusual harmonic quality, as if multiple tones were speaking in unison. "We have been expecting you." The statement chilled me more than her appearance. I had told no one except Ezra about my destination, and the isolated nature of the community made communication with the outside world seem unlikely. When I asked how she could have known of my coming, she smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. "The forest tells us many things," she replied, moving with a flowing gait that seemed to involve more joints than human locomotion should require. "We have learned to listen to its voices over the generations. My name is Sarah Birch. My family founded this settlement in 1847, and we have watched it grow and change as the mountain has taught us." Over the following hours, Sarah shared the history of Birch Hollow, a narrative that challenged everything I thought I knew about human adaptation and community development. According to her account, the original settlers had arrived seeking isolation and freedom to practice beliefs that mainstream society would not tolerate. They had discovered something in these mountains, something ancient that had been waiting for the right people to recognize its presence. "The change began slowly," Sarah explained, as we walked between the settlement's buildings. "At first, it was just dreams, visions that came to our ancestors during their deepest sleep. Then physical alterations began to manifest. Extra joints in the fingers allowed for better manipulation of tools and weapons. Enhanced night vision permitted hunting and gathering after sunset. Elongated limbs provided speed and agility beyond normal human capability. As if summoned by her words, other members of the community began to appear. They emerged from buildings and forest paths with that same flowing movement I had observed in Sarah, their altered anatomy creating an unsettling grace that was both beautiful and deeply disturbing. Men, women, and children all showed similar modifications, though the degree of change varied by age. The youngest members appeared almost normal, while the eldest had transformed so dramatically that their humanity was barely recognizable. The children were perhaps the most unsettling. They moved in small groups, playing games that involved feats of agility impossible for normal human children. I watched as they scaled vertical walls with ease, their elongated fingers finding purchase on seemingly smooth surfaces. Their laughter carried strange harmonics, creating sounds that seemed to resonate from the forest itself. When I inquired about the nature of these changes, Sarah led me to a path that wound up the mountainside behind the settlement. To understand what we have become, she said, you must see where it began. The trail ended at a natural amphitheater formed by towering rock walls, at the center of which stood a structure that defied easy description. Built from the same red stones I had seen in the creek bed, it resembled no architecture I had encountered in my studies. The stones fit together without mortar, held in place by their own impossible geometry. The overall shape suggested something organic, as if the building had grown rather than been constructed. This was here when our ancestors arrived, Sarah explained. They believed it was abandoned, but they learned otherwise. The presence that dwells within welcomed them, offered them gifts that would allow them to thrive in this harsh environment. The price was simple: transformation into something better adapted to mountain life. As we approached the structure, I became aware of a sound emanating from within, a low, harmonic hum that seemed to resonate in my bones. The closer we drew, the more intense the sensation became, until I felt as though the sound was attempting to restructure something fundamental within my body. My vision began to blur, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw the forest differently, with sharper detail and colors that had no names. Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder, her elongated fingers spanning nearly the width of my back. "It calls to you," she observed with what might have been satisfaction. Few outsiders respond so readily to its invitation. The implication in her words snapped me back to full awareness. I realized that whatever force had transformed the residents of Birch Hollow was beginning to affect me as well. The academic curiosity that had driven me to seek out isolated communities suddenly seemed less important than self-preservation. I made excuses about needing to return to my research station before dark, promising to return the following day for more extensive documentation. Sarah seemed amused by my obvious discomfort, but made no attempt to prevent my departure. As I hurried back down the mountain trail, I could hear sounds following me through the forest, keeping pace but remaining hidden among the trees. The return journey to Devil's Tooth took on nightmare qualities as darkness fell. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes, and the sounds of the forest carried implications of pursuit. When I finally reached the granite outcropping where Ezra had left me, I found him waiting with obvious relief. "I was starting to think you weren't coming back," he admitted as we began the descent towards civilization. Most folks who go looking for Birch Hollow don't return at all. When I pressed him for details, Ezra revealed that the settlement's reputation extended far beyond casual local folklore. Hunters and trappers had been disappearing in that region for over a century, usually individuals who ventured too deep into the mountain wilderness alone. Search parties occasionally found abandoned campsites and personal belongings, but bodies were never recovered. The Birch family and their kind, they don't take kindly to folks spreading stories about them, Ezra explained, but they also don't seem to mind if people go missing permanent-like. Word is they're always looking for new blood to join their little community, if you catch my meaning. I never submitted my doctoral research on Birch Hollow. Instead, I changed my dissertation topic to safer ground, focusing on documented communities with extensive written records. But the experience haunted me, particularly as I began to notice subtle changes in my own physiology. My night vision improved dramatically, allowing me to see clearly in darkness that would blind normal humans. My joints became more flexible, permitting movements that should have been impossible given normal human anatomy. Most disturbing was the compulsion I felt to return to those mountains. On quiet nights, I could hear something calling from the eastern wilderness, a sound below the threshold of normal hearing that promised a transformation and belonging. I resisted the urge for nearly 30 years, but the call has grown stronger with each passing season. Last month, I finally retired from my position at the university. My colleagues attributed my departure to normal aging, but the truth is that the changes have progressed to the point where concealment is becoming difficult. My students have begun to notice things, asking questions about my unusual height and the way my eyes seem to glow in dim lecture halls. I write this account as a warning to future researchers who might be tempted to investigate the remote settlements of Appalachia. Some communities remain isolated for very good reasons, and some transformations, once begun, cannot be reversed. The mountains hold secrets that are better left undisturbed, and the price of certain knowledge is higher than any academic achievement could justify. Tomorrow, I return to Birch Hollow. The calling has become too strong to resist, and I suspect Sarah and her people have been waiting patiently for my inevitable return. Perhaps transformation is not the curse I once believed it to be. Perhaps it is simply evolution, guided by forces older than human civilization, preparing us for a future we cannot yet imagine. But if you are reading this, if you are a researcher drawn to the mysteries of isolated communities, heed this warning. Some knowledge is not meant for human minds, and some places change you in ways that can never be undone. In October of 1993, Dr. James Whitmore, a cultural anthropologist from Virginia Commonwealth University, arrived in the remote mountain community of Pine Ridge Hollow to conduct what would become his final field research. His mission was straightforward: document the oral traditions and folklore of one of Appalachia's most isolated settlements. What he discovered would challenge every assumption he held about the boundaries between myth and reality. Pine Ridge Hollow existed in a geographical pocket so remote that cellular service remained non-existent even in the 1990s. The settlement consisted of approximately 40 families, all descended from original homesteaders who had arrived in the 1820s fleeing religious persecution in the eastern settlements. Dr. Whitmore had selected this community specifically because of their reputation for maintaining pre industrial traditions and their rumored reluctance to interact with outside researchers. The initial signs that something was fundamentally different about Pine Ridge became apparent during his first week in residence. Dr. Whitmore had arranged to stay with the Caldwell family, who operated the settlement's only boarding house. Martha Caldwell, a woman in her 70s with piercing blue eyes and an unsettling habit of speaking in incomplete sentences, served as his primary contact with the community. The mountain folk here got their own ways, she explained during his arrival, her weathered hands constantly moving in what appeared to be unconscious gestures. Some things been here longer than people, if you catch my meaning. Best to keep your eyes on what's civilized and let the rest be. Dr. Whitmore initially dismissed such statements as typical mountain superstition, colorful folklore that would add authenticity to his research. His academic training had prepared him to navigate the complex relationship between literal belief and metaphorical truth in isolated communities. However, his confidence began to erode as he encountered increasingly specific and consistent accounts of what locals referred to as the changed ones. The first detailed description came from Samuel Hicks, an elderly man who had spent his entire 78 years in Pine Ridge Hollow. Unlike many mountain residents who spoke in vague generalities about supernatural phenomena, Samuel provided precise, detailed testimony that read more like a biological field report than folklore. "They ain't exactly people anymore," Samuel explained during their third interview, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite the fact that they sat alone in his cabin. Started maybe 30 years back, when the Brennan family went up to Crow's Peak for their yearly hunting. Came back after 3 days, but something was wrong with their boy Tommy. He was always a small kid, maybe 5'4", but when he came down from that mountain, he stood near 7 feet tall. Samuel paused to light his pipe, his hands trembling slightly as he continued. But it wasn't just his height. His arms hung different, like they had extra joints in them, and his face, Lord help me, his face looked like someone had stretched it on a frame. His mama tried to pretend nothing had changed, but we all seen it. Tommy's eyes had gone completely black, not just the pupils, but the whole thing, like looking into deep water at night. Dr. Whitmore pressed for more specific details, applying the methodical interview techniques he had developed over 2 decades of fieldwork. Samuel's responses consistently contained elements that defied easy categorization as either pure imagination or straightforward observation. The worst part was how he moved, Samuel continued. Tommy used to be clumsy, always tripping over his own feet, but after Crow's Peak, he moved like he was floating an inch off the ground, never made a sound when he walked, even on dry leaves, and he could bend in ways that ain't natural, like his spine was made of rope instead of bone. Over the following weeks, Dr. Whitmore collected similar accounts from 17 different residents, all describing encounters with individuals who had undergone dramatic physical transformations after venturing into specific areas of the surrounding mountains. The consistency of these reports troubled him profoundly. While folklore typically evolved and changed with each telling, these accounts maintained remarkable uniformity in their essential details. The transformed individuals, according to multiple witnesses, shared several consistent characteristics: extraordinary height gains of 2 to 3 feet, elongated limbs with additional joint flexibility, completely black eyes, and an unnatural silent movement pattern. More disturbing were reports of behavioral changes that suggested cognitive alterations beyond simple physical transformation. Martha Caldwell's own grandson, David, had apparently undergone this change 3 years prior to Dr. Whitmore's arrival. "He still knows us," she explained during one of their evening conversations, her voice carrying a mixture of love and fear. "But he don't talk the same way. Sometimes he'll say things that haven't happened yet, like he can see forward in time, and other times he'll answer questions nobody asked, like he's hearing voices we can't hear." Dr. Whitmore requested to interview David directly, but was consistently told that he remained in the high mountains, returning to the settlement only occasionally and always at night. Several residents mentioned seeing a tall figure moving between buildings after midnight, but these sightings were always described in hushed, fearful tones. The breakthrough in Dr. Whitmore's research came during his 4th week in Pine Ridge Hollow, when he encountered David Caldwell personally. The meeting occurred at approximately 2 in the morning, when Dr. Whitmore, suffering from insomnia brought on by the altitude and stress of his research, stepped onto the boarding house porch for fresh air. A figure stood motionless beside the large oak tree that dominated the front yard, so perfectly still that Dr. Whitmore initially mistook it for a stump or fence post. Only when the figure turned to look directly at him did he realize he was observing another human being. The individual who approached matched every description he had collected: unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed to bend and flex in ways that violated normal human anatomy. "You're the one asking questions about us," David said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. Despite the darkness, Dr. Whitmore could clearly see the young man's entirely black eyes, which reflected the moonlight like polished stones. The conversation that followed lasted approximately 40 minutes and would be the most disturbing experience of Dr. Whitmore's academic career. David spoke with perfect articulation and demonstrated comprehensive knowledge not only of Dr. Whitmore's research, but of academic anthropology in general. More unsettling, he displayed detailed awareness of Dr. Whitmore's personal life, including information about his family, his previous research projects, and his academic career that no one in Pine Ridge Hollow could possibly have known. "Your studies focus on how isolated communities maintain their cultural identity," David observed, moving closer with that characteristic silent gliding motion. "But you're operating under the assumption that culture is something created by humans. What if culture is something that creates humans instead?" Dr. Whitmore attempted to steer the conversation toward the physical transformations, asking direct questions about the process by which normal individuals became these changed ones. David's responses revealed a level of biological sophistication that suggested either extensive medical knowledge or direct experiential understanding of human anatomy. "The mountain doesn't change us," David explained, his elongated fingers gesturing in precise, almost surgical movements. "The mountain reveals what we've always been capable of becoming. Your species limits itself through belief systems that assume your current form is permanent. We've simply learned to shed those limitations. When Dr. Whitmore asked about the mechanism of transformation, David's explanation ventured into territory that challenged conventional understanding of biology and physics. There are places in these mountains where the boundary between what you call possible and impossible becomes permeable. Crow's Peak is one such location. The limestone formations there contain mineral compositions that exist nowhere else on Earth, arranged in geometric patterns that couldn't have formed through natural geological processes. David continued his explanation, describing underground chamber systems that supposedly connected to networks extending throughout the Appalachian Range. According to his account, these chambers contained what he termed resonance fields that could alter human physiology at the cellular level. The process, he claimed, required voluntary participation and could not be imposed on unwilling subjects. The transformation begins with acceptance, David explained. Those who resist the process experience only discomfort and confusion, but those who embrace it discover capabilities that your medical science insists are impossible: enhanced sensory perception, increased physical flexibility, and most importantly, access to information networks that connect all changed ones across the mountain range. Dr. Whitmore pressed for clarification regarding these information networks, and David's response suggested something resembling telepathic communication. We share experiences directly, without the limitations of language. When one of us encounters something significant, all of us know about it immediately. It's how we knew you were coming to Pine Ridge Hollow 3 weeks before you arrived. The implications of this claim disturbed Dr. Whitmore profoundly. If accurate, it suggested that his research had been monitored and potentially manipulated from its inception. David confirmed this suspicion with casual directness that left no room for doubt. We've been guiding your research since you first contacted Martha about staying here, he admitted. The residents you've interviewed, the stories they've told you, even this conversation, we've orchestrated all of it to help you understand what we are and what we represent. Dr. Whitmore demanded to know why they had chosen to reveal themselves to him specifically. David's answer provided the most chilling revelation of their entire encounter. Because you're going to join us, David stated with absolute certainty. The process has already begun. You've been breathing the air here for 4 weeks, drinking water from our wells, eating food grown in our soil. The mineral compounds necessary for transformation have been accumulating in your system since your first day in Pine Ridge Hollow. Dr. Whitmore immediately felt a surge of panic, but David raised one elongated hand in a gesture that somehow conveyed reassurance despite the terrifying context. The physical changes don't manifest until you visit one of the resonance sites, he explained. You still have a choice. You can leave Pine Ridge Hollow tomorrow and return to your university. The mineral compounds will gradually leave your system over the course of several months, and you'll experience no permanent effects. But if you choose to stay, David continued, if you allow yourself to see Crow's Peak, you'll understand that what we've become isn't a loss of humanity. It's an evolution beyond the limitations that have constrained your species for millennia. Dr. Whitmore spent the remainder of that night in his room, meticulously documenting every detail of his conversation with David while struggling to process the implications. His academic training demanded skepticism, yet the evidence he had accumulated over 4 weeks of careful research supported at least some aspects of David's extraordinary claims. The following morning, Martha Caldwell greeted him with knowing eyes and a sad smile. "David talked to you last night," she observed. "It wasn't a question. He told you about the choice you got to make." Dr. Whitmore confirmed her assumption and asked for her advice as someone who had witnessed multiple family members undergo the transformation. Martha's response reflected the complex mixture of loss and acceptance that seemed to characterize the entire community's relationship with the changed ones. "It ain't death," she said carefully, "but it ain't life the way we understand it either. David's still my grandson, but he's also something else now, something bigger and stranger and more connected to this place than any of us regular folks can comprehend." She paused to pour coffee with hands that shook slightly, then continued her explanation. "The changed ones, they say they're happier than they ever were before. They talk about being part of something larger, about understanding things that the rest of us can't even imagine, but they also can't come back to what they were. Once you make that choice, it's permanent." Dr. Whitmore faced an impossible decision. His scientific training demanded that he investigate Crow's Peak to verify or debunk David's claims about transformation chambers and mineral compositions. Yet David had made it clear that visiting the site would trigger irreversible changes to his physiology and consciousness. After 3 days of agonizing deliberation, Dr. Whitmore made his choice. On November 3rd, 1993, he packed his research materials and left Pine Ridge Hollow without visiting Crow's Peak. He returned to Virginia Commonwealth University and submitted a research report that attributed the community's transformation stories to collective psychological phenomena related to social isolation and cultural preservation instincts. However, Dr. Whitmore's private papers, discovered after his death in 2018, tell a different story. His personal journals reveal that he never stopped thinking about Pine Ridge Hollow and the choice he had made. More troubling, they document a series of recurring dreams in which he found himself transformed and living among the changed ones in the high mountain caves. The final entry in his journal, dated just 3 days before his death, reads, "They're still calling to me. After 25 years, I can still hear David's voice in my dreams, telling me it's not too late to come home. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Sometimes I think I should have stayed to see what I might have become." Dr. Whitmore never returned to Pine Ridge Hollow, but satellite imagery from recent years shows that the settlement appears to be abandoned. The buildings remain intact, but no signs of human habitation are visible. Local authorities report that the access roads have become impassable, though they cannot explain why or when this occurred. Yet hikers in the region occasionally report seeing tall figures moving through the forest at night, always silent, always just beyond clear visibility. These sightings are consistent with descriptions of the changed ones, suggesting that they may have withdrawn deeper into the mountains rather than disappeared entirely. The mountains of Appalachia have always harbored secrets in their ancient hollows and hidden valleys. Dr. Whitmore's research suggests that some of these secrets involve possibilities that modern science has yet to acknowledge or understand. Whether the changed ones represent evolution, devolution, or something altogether outside human categorization remains an open question. What seems certain is that the choice David Caldwell offered to Dr. Whitmore between remaining human or becoming something else entirely continues to wait in the high places of the mountains, patient and eternal as the stone itself. The scholarly pursuit of regional folklore often leads researchers into unexpected territories where empirical observation intersects with phenomena that challenge conventional academic frameworks. Such was the case during my investigation into the demographic anomalies of Greystone Hollow, a remote settlement in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where population records revealed patterns that defied standard historical analysis. My name is Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, and I served as a research anthropologist for the Smithsonian Institution's Department of Cultural Documentation from 1985 to 2003. The case that ended my career began as a routine demographic study commissioned by the National Park Service, investigating historical settlement patterns in areas designated for potential wilderness expansion. What I discovered in Greystone Hollow fundamentally altered my understanding of human adaptation and community evolution in isolated mountain environments. The initial data presented intriguing inconsistencies. Census records from 1890 through 1950 showed a stable population of approximately 180 residents, yet birth and death certificates suggested demographic fluctuations that should have resulted in either significant population growth or decline. More puzzling was the complete absence of migration records. No documented cases existed of residents leaving Greystone Hollow permanently, nor of new families arriving from external communities. The settlement occupied a geographical position that seemed deliberately chosen for isolation. Nestled within a natural amphitheater formed by converging ridgelines, Greystone Hollow remained accessible only through a single mountain pass that local topographical surveys indicated had been artificially narrowed sometime in the mid-1800s. This engineering feat, if accurately documented, would have required sophisticated knowledge of geological principles and access to equipment that rural mountain communities typically did not possess. My first visit to Greystone Hollow in September 1997 revealed a community that appeared frozen in temporal stasis. The settlement's architecture reflected building techniques spanning multiple decades, yet all structures showed uniform weathering patterns suggesting simultaneous construction. More striking was the apparent absence of technological progression. While neighboring communities had gradually adopted modern conveniences, Greystone Hollow maintained pre-industrial practices with remarkable consistency. The residents themselves presented the most compelling anomaly. Physical anthropological assessment revealed genetic characteristics that suggested either extraordinary hereditary isolation or systematic selective breeding practices extending across multiple generations. Average height among adult males exceeded 6 feet 4 inches, with correspondingly elongated limb proportions that fell outside normal human variation parameters. Facial bone structure displayed pronounced angular features, and eye coloration clustered within a narrow spectrum of pale blue and gray variations. More unsettling were the behavioral observations. Community interactions followed ritualized patterns that seemed to operate according to unspoken protocols. Conversations ceased abruptly upon my approach, resuming only after I had moved beyond auditory range. Children exhibited synchronized movement patterns when observed in groups, maintaining precise spatial relationships that suggested choreographed coordination rather than natural social behavior. The community's economic structure defied conventional understanding of subsistence patterns. Despite apparent isolation from external markets, residents possessed manufactured goods and materials that required industrial production capabilities. When questioned about supply sources, community members provided vague references to traditional trading arrangements, but could not specify trading partners or transportation methods. Agricultural practices presented equally puzzling elements. Crop yields appeared to exceed what local soil conditions and climate patterns should have supported. Botanical analysis of harvested grains revealed genetic modifications that predated known agricultural science by several decades. More disturbing was the discovery of cultivation areas that seemed to follow geometric patterns visible only from elevated observation points, suggesting planning methodologies that required aerial perspective capabilities unavailable to 19th century rural communities. The breakthrough in my investigation occurred during my third visit in November 1997, when I was granted permission to observe what residents termed a community gathering. These assemblies, held monthly during new moon phases, took place in a natural clearing approximately 1 mile from the main settlement. The site featured a circular arrangement of standing stones that geological surveys suggested had been transported from quarries located over 50 miles away. The gathering I observed then challenged every assumption I had formed about Greystone Hollow's social dynamics. Approximately 200 residents participated, including individuals I had not encountered during previous visits. Most remarkable was the presence of elderly community members who appeared decades older than any residents I had previously documented, suggesting either remarkable longevity or the existence of a concealed population segment. The ceremony began with participants arranging themselves in concentric circles according to apparent hierarchical positioning. The outermost circle consisted of children and adolescents, followed by adult community members, with the innermost circle reserved for elderly individuals whose advanced age seemed to exceed normal human life expectancy. Central to these arrangements stood a figure I had not previously encountered, whose physical characteristics deviated significantly from even the unusual norms I had observed among other residents. This central figure, referred to by others as the Elder, displayed anatomical features that suggested either extreme genetic mutation or something beyond standard human variation. Height exceeded 7 feet, with limb proportions that created an impression of barely controlled elongation. Facial structure retained recognizably human characteristics, while incorporating angular features that seemed to shift in appearance depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. The ritual itself involved synchronized vocalizations that created harmonic frequencies, unlike any documented folk music traditions. Participants moved through choreographed sequences that required physical flexibility beyond normal human capabilities. Most disturbing was the apparent communication method employed during the ceremony. Participants seemed to respond to unspoken directions, maintaining perfect coordination without visible or audible cues. As the evening progressed, I observed transformations that challenged my ability to maintain objective documentation. Several participants exhibited physical changes that appeared to modify their basic anatomical structure. Limbs seemed to extend and contract, facial features shifted configuration, and movement patterns transitioned from human locomotion to something resembling predatory animal behavior. The climax of the ceremony involved the selection of 3 community members who were led to the center of the stone circle. What transpired next defied rational explanation. The selected individuals appeared to undergo systematic physical modifications that altered their fundamental biological structure. The process, which lasted approximately 20 minutes, resulted in beings that retained human consciousness while displaying anatomical characteristics that suggested evolutionary adaptation toward enhanced physical capabilities. When the ceremony concluded, I attempted to document my observations through standard anthropological notation methods. However, upon reviewing my field notes the following morning, I discovered that my written records contained information I could not recall observing or recording. Detailed descriptions of biological transformation processes, anatomical measurements, and behavioral patterns filled pages of documentation in my own handwriting, yet I retained no conscious memory of producing these notes. More disturbing was the discovery that my photographic equipment had malfunctioned during the ceremony, producing images that showed not the gathering I had witnessed, but landscape photographs of the empty clearing taken during daylight hours. Video recording equipment yielded similar results, capturing only ambient forest sounds rather than the harmonic vocalizations I clearly remembered hearing. The final element of my investigation occurred during my departure from Greystone Hollow. As I prepared to leave the community, the elder approached my vehicle and engaged me in a conversation that revealed knowledge of my professional background, research objectives, and personal history that I had not shared with any community members. More unsettling was the direct statement that my investigation had been permitted as part of a broader assessment of external academic interest in their community. The elder explained that Greystone Hollow represented what they termed evolutionary adaptation in progress. According to this account, the community had been deliberately established as an experimental environment for human development beyond conventional biological limitations. The process, initiated in the 1840s, involved selective breeding practices, environmental modifications, and what the elder described as consciousness enhancement techniques designed to produce humans capable of thriving in extreme environmental conditions. The transformations I had witnessed during the ceremony represented not supernatural phenomena, but advanced biological modification techniques that the community had developed through generations of experimentation. The goal, according to the elder, was the creation of human beings capable of surviving environmental challenges that would render normal human populations extinct. When I inquired about the source of this knowledge and the methodology employed, the elder's response suggested collaboration with entities or intelligences that predated human civilization in the region. References were made to ancient partnerships and inherited obligations that bound the community to continue their experimental work in exchange for protection and guidance. The conversation concluded with a warning that my documentation of Greystone Hollow would be managed to ensure that external interference did not compromise their ongoing work. The elder indicated that while they had permitted my observation as a courtesy to academic institutions, any attempt to publish findings or direct additional researchers to their location would result in consequences that extended beyond professional repercussions. Upon returning to Washington, I discovered that my research files had been classified by unknown federal agencies, and my access to the documentation had been restricted. Attempts to contact colleagues who had approved the original research project revealed that no official record existed of my assignment to investigate Greystone Hollow. The National Park Service denied any knowledge of demographic studies in that region, and my own employment records showed a 6-month leave of absence that I could not recall requesting. Subsequent attempts to return to Greystone Hollow proved unsuccessful. The mountain pass that had provided access to the settlement could not be located, despite detailed topographical maps and GPS coordinates. Local residents in neighboring communities claimed no knowledge of Greystone Hollow and suggested that I might be confusing the area with other mountain settlements. The final confirmation of my experience came through medical examination, revealing genetic modifications to my own cellular structure that could not be explained through natural processes. Blood analysis showed the presence of genetic markers that did not match my previous medical records, and physical examination revealed subtle anatomical changes that enhanced certain sensory capabilities while requiring dietary modifications that I had not consciously implemented. Today, nearly 25 years after my investigation, I continue to experience dreams that provide detailed information about Greystone Hollow's ongoing activities. These nocturnal visions suggest that the community's experimental work has expanded to include remote influence capabilities that extend far beyond their geographical boundaries. The transformation of human beings into something more adaptable, more resilient, and more capable of surviving environmental extremes continues according to schedules and methodologies that seem to operate according to timescales measured in centuries rather than decades. The most troubling aspect of these revelations is the growing realization that Greystone Hollow represents not an isolated phenomenon, but one component of a larger network of experimental communities scattered throughout remote regions of North America. The consistency of reports describing similar communities, the parallel documentation of anomalous demographic patterns, and the systematic suppression of academic investigation suggest coordinated efforts that extend far beyond the capabilities of isolated mountain settlements. Whether these communities represent human evolution guided by advanced scientific knowledge, collaboration with non-human intelligences, or something else entirely, remains unknown. What seems certain is that the transformation of human beings into creatures better adapted to environmental challenges continues in locations that remain hidden from conventional academic scrutiny, protected by geographical isolation and institutional mechanisms that ensure their work proceeds without external interference. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes those secrets transform the very people who seek to uncover them. I met Sarah Whitmore in a small diner just outside Beckley, West Virginia, on a gray October morning in 2019. She had contacted me through my university email after reading my research on Appalachian folklore, claiming she had an account that would interest me. What she shared over coffee and cigarettes that day challenged everything I thought I knew about the mountains and the things that might live within them. Sarah worked as a park ranger for the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, specializing in remote wilderness areas where few tourists ventured. She had spent 15 years patrolling the backcountry, documenting wildlife populations and maintaining trail systems in regions so isolated that some hadn't been fully mapped since the 1940s. Her credentials were impeccable, her reputation spotless. She had no reason to fabricate what she told me, and every reason to keep it buried. The incident occurred in September 2018, during what should have been a routine wildlife survey in the Cranberry Wilderness. Sarah had been assigned to investigate reports of unusual animal behavior in a remote valley known locally as Painter's Hollow, named for the mountain lions that once roamed the area. Local hunters had reported strange tracks, unexplained sounds, and livestock disappearances that didn't match typical predator patterns. Sarah entered the valley alone, as protocol dictated for preliminary surveys. The hollow stretched nearly 12 miles from its mouth to its headwaters, enclosed by ridges so steep and densely forested that satellite imagery revealed little of what lay beneath the canopy. The terrain was treacherous, crisscrossed by unmarked game trails and seasonal streams that could trap an unwary hiker for days. On her second day in the valley, Sarah established a base camp near an old logging road that petered out into overgrown track. The area showed signs of human activity from decades past, rusted equipment, and the remnants of a logging operation that had apparently ceased abruptly. She found this odd, as valuable timber still stood throughout the valley, seemingly untouched by commercial harvesting. It was on the third morning that Sarah first noticed she was being watched. The sensation began as a vague unease, the kind experienced hikers develop after years of trusting their instincts in wild places. Something about the forest felt wrong. The normal sounds of wildlife had diminished to an unnatural quiet. Birds that should have been active in the early morning remained silent. Even the insects seemed subdued. Sarah had documented similar phenomena in areas where large predators established territory, but this felt different. The silence carried a weight that pressed against her consciousness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She continued her survey work, marking GPS coordinates and collecting biological samples, but found herself constantly checking over her shoulder. By midday, the feeling of being observed had intensified. Sarah possessed the heightened awareness that comes from years of solitary work in potentially dangerous environments. She could distinguish between the natural alertness animals displayed and something more deliberate, more intelligent. Whatever was watching her possessed a patience and focus that unnerved her. As she documented a series of unusual claw marks on a massive oak tree, Sarah heard the first vocalization. It began as a low rumbling, almost subsonic, that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. The sound carried a quality she had never encountered in 15 years of wilderness work, somewhere between a growl and something disturbingly human. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively moving to the bear spray attached to her belt. The vocalization continued for nearly 30 seconds, emanating from the dense underbrush approximately 50 yards upslope from her position. She strained to identify the source, running through her mental catalog of regional wildlife sounds. Nothing matched. The rumbling ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She waited, barely breathing, for several minutes before continuing her work. But the feeling of being watched never subsided. That evening, as Sarah reviewed her field notes by the light of her headlamp, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. In her photographs of the claw marks on the oak tree, barely visible in the shadows behind the trunk, was a shape that defied immediate identification. It appeared to be crouching, partially concealed by vegetation, but what disturbed her most was its size. If the object in the photograph was indeed an animal, it stood at least 7 feet tall, even in its hunched position. Sarah spent that night in her tent with her equipment arranged defensively around her, the bear spray within easy reach, and her radio tuned to the emergency frequency. She slept in brief intervals, waking repeatedly to sounds that might have been wind through the trees or something large moving carefully through the underbrush just beyond the reach of her vision. On the 4th day, Sarah made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Instead of completing her survey and returning to report her findings, she chose to investigate the source of the phenomena she had documented. Professional curiosity had overcome her instincts for self-preservation, a decision she later described as the worst mistake of her life. She followed a game trail deeper into the valley than any of her maps indicated, climbing steadily toward a series of limestone outcroppings that formed natural shelters in the mountainside. The trail showed signs of regular use, but the tracks she found pressed into the soft earth beside a creek crossing defied classification. They appeared humanoid, but were far too large, with elongated digits that ended in what could only be described as claws. As Sarah photographed the tracks, she became aware of a sound that raised every hair on her arms. Somewhere ahead, echoing from the limestone caves, came what could only be described as conversation. Multiple voices engaged in exchange, but speaking in no language she recognized. The vocalizations carried tones and inflections that suggested complex communication, but the underlying sounds were wrong, as if human speech patterns were being attempted by vocal apparatus not designed for such use. Sarah approached the cave system with extreme caution, using her climbing gear to access a vantage point on the cliff face above the main entrance. What she observed from that position challenged her understanding of the natural world so fundamentally that she initially convinced herself she was suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration. Below her, in a natural amphitheater formed by the converging limestone caves, was a gathering unlike anything documented in scientific literature. 7 figures moved around a central fire pit, their forms clearly humanoid but wrong in ways that her mind struggled to process. They stood upright like humans, but possessed proportions that seemed stretched and distorted. Their limbs were too long, their torsos too narrow, and their heads bore shapes that suggested skull structures, unlike any known primate. Most disturbing was their behavior. These creatures moved with deliberate intelligence, tending the fire, arranging objects in patterns that suggested ritual significance, and engaging in that strange conversational exchange Sarah had heard from a distance. They wore no clothing, but seemed unbothered by the cool mountain air that had forced Sarah to don multiple layers. One of the creatures carried what appeared to be the hindquarter of a large animal, possibly a deer, though Sarah couldn't identify the species from her elevated position. The meat was prepared and shared among the group in a manner that displayed clear social organization and cooperative behavior. These were not mindless beasts driven by instinct, but entities capable of complex social interaction and cultural practices. Sarah observed this gathering for over an hour, documenting everything she could with her camera's telephoto lens and taking detailed notes in her field journal. The creatures appeared aware of their surroundings, but showed no indication they had detected her presence. Their activities suggested this site served as a regular meeting place, a conclusion supported by the well-worn paths leading to the amphitheater and evidence of previous fires. As the sun began to set, the gathering concluded with what could only be described as a ceremony. The creatures arranged themselves in a circle around the fire and engaged in a vocalization that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Their voices harmonized in ways that suggested musical sophistication while producing sounds that made Sarah's bones ache with sympathetic vibration. When the ceremony ended, the creatures dispersed into the cave system with a coordination that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. Within minutes, Sarah found herself alone on the cliff face, questioning whether she had actually witnessed the scene or suffered some form of psychological break brought on by isolation and stress. But the photographs on her camera told a different story. Image after image documented the impossible gathering, providing evidence that could potentially revolutionize anthropological understanding of North American fauna. Sarah faced a decision that would define the remainder of her career and her life: report her findings and risk professional destruction, or remain silent and protect herself from accusations of fraud or mental instability. Sarah chose silence. She completed her official survey report, documenting the unusual tracks and vocalizations as evidence of an unknown large predator species, possibly a black bear variant, exhibiting unusual territorial behavior. Her photographs of the creatures were filed away in a personal archive she had never shared with another soul until our meeting in that Beckley diner. In the months following her encounter, Sarah researched similar accounts in historical records and indigenous oral traditions. She discovered a consistent pattern of reports dating back centuries, describing encounters with humanoid creatures in the deepest parts of the Appalachian wilderness. These accounts shared remarkable consistency in their descriptions of intelligent, bipedal beings that seemed to exist parallel to human civilization while avoiding direct contact. What troubled Sarah most was the growing body of evidence suggesting these encounters were increasing in frequency. Climate change and expanding human development were forcing both human and non-human inhabitants of the mountains into closer proximity, creating the potential for conflicts that neither species was prepared to handle. Sarah retired from the Park Service in early 2019, officially citing health concerns, but privately acknowledging that she could no longer perform her duties, knowing what she knew about the mountain's true inhabitants. She moved to a small town outside the wilderness areas and took a position teaching environmental science at a community college, but she never stopped monitoring reports from the backcountry. Our conversation in that diner lasted nearly 4 hours. Sarah shared not just her account, but copies of her photographs, field notes, and the research she had conducted since her retirement. The evidence was compelling, but I understood why she had kept it secret. Publishing such findings would require a level of peer review and verification that could expose her to ridicule or worse. As I prepared to leave, Sarah made one final statement that has stayed with me ever since. She looked directly into my eyes and said, "Professor, we're not alone in these mountains, and we never have been. The question isn't whether these creatures exist. The question is what happens when the rest of the world finds out." I drove back to my university that evening with Sarah's materials secured in my briefcase, knowing that I possessed evidence of one of the most significant discoveries in modern anthropology. But I also understood the weight of responsibility that came with such knowledge. Sarah had trusted me with her secret, and I would have to decide whether the world was ready for the truth about what lives in the deepest, darkest hollows of Appalachia.